In 1953, Henry Mollison underwent a radical lobotomy that destroyed his ability to create new memories. He lived his life in 30-second increments.
I cannot think of a single instance in the history of cognitive psychology where one case study led to such radical breakthroughs in our understanding of a cognitive function, in this case, memory.
In the early 1900s, little was known about the brain and its functions. Physicians relied on Sigmund Freud's discussion-based psychotherapy as the primary treatment for mental illness. Largely ineffective and time-consuming, doctors began experimenting with other techniques in the early 1930s, such as insulin-induced comas, electroshock therapy, and antipsychotics. When these failed, doctors turned toward more radical treatments.
Antipsychotics, so to speak, doesn't always work for everybody, so that's when the surgical aspect come in.
After Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz performed the first lobotomy in 1935, Walter Freeman introduced the procedure in the United States. A fervent advocate for these brain surgeries, Freeman traveled across the country performing over 3,000 lobotomies and gaining many supporters, most notably Dr. William Beecher Scoville, a neurosurgeon at Hartford Hospital.
My grandfather was a zealous proponent and sort of proselytizer for the procedure. He ultimately went on to perform so many lobotomies that basically he was number 2 behind a man named Walter Freeman in terms of total number of lobotomies performed.
In 1943, Dr. Scoville was introduced to the patient who would immortalize him in the field of neuroscience, Henry Gustav Mollison. Henry was born on February 26, 1926 in Hartford, Connecticut, and began suffering from epileptic seizures at the age of 10. Unresponsive to his many medications, his seizures became so frequent and intense that he was forbidden from walking across the stage of his high school graduation. Concerned about the ineffectiveness of Henry's various prescriptions, Scoville proposed a radical lobotomy despite his inability to detect the origin of Henry's seizures.
In Henry's case, he had this opportunity to, A, hopefully again, provide some kind of therapeutic benefit to Henry, and B, advance his and, by extension, the world's understanding of what these sort of mysterious structures in the brain did.
Although Scoville had performed lobotomies on various patients with mental illnesses, Henry would be the first epileptic patient to receive the operation, which the doctor himself called frankly experimental. Despite uncertain risks, Henry and his family gave consent for the procedure, and on August 25, 1953, Scoville performed the procedure that changed Henry's life and the face of neuroscience forever.
Through 2 silver dollar-sized holes carved at Henry's brow, Scoville suctioned out the uncus, amygdala, front half of the hippocampus, and parts of the surrounding cortex. He mirrored this procedure on both lobes, performing a bilateral operation.
From one tragic existence to another, Henry's life was again controlled by an unrelenting medical condition. Although his seizures were greatly diminished, Henry was only able to retain new information for 30 seconds at a time and was unable to recall memories from the past 3 years of his life.
His life, in many senses, kind of stopped on that operating table. After this sort of final cut, Henry Mollison became patient HM.
When the running narrative of Henry's life came to a close, the story of patient HM was at its exposition. The personal tragedy of Henry's amnesia would soon lead to a pivotal triumph in the realm of neuroscience.
In 1955, graduate student Brenda Milner was sent by her mentor, neurologist Wilder Penfield, to meet HM. Penfield hypothesized that the temporal lobes were linked to the creation of long-term memory. Because his patients received unilateral surgeries, Penfield hoped that patient HM, who had undergone a unique bilateral lobotomy, would provide proof for this hypothesis.
They could actually see what the absence of the hippocampus did, and kind of got lucky in that the absence of the hippocampus did lead to very characteristic deficits, strikingly characteristic deficits, where he could not retain any declarative factual information based on recent life experiences.
In 1957, Milner and Scoville published their co-authored study. Through a comparison of various patients who received temporal lobe lobotomies, they concluded that bilateral medial temporal lobe resection in man results in a persistent impairment of recent memory. This confirmation of a long-held hypothesis forms the basis of HM's contributions to neuroscience, which are only just the beginning.
After this publication, Milner continued to perform various tests on Henry. One experiment involved Henry tracing a line between a double-bordered star while watching his hand in a mirror. Henry gradually improved at the task despite having no recollection of his previous attempts, demonstrating that non-declarative memory is not located in the hippocampal regions. Milner said it was very much of an aha moment to see that HM had learned the task perfectly, but with absolutely no awareness that he had done it before was an amazing dissociation. From this one aha moment came a plethora of knowledge that makes up the basis of our modern-day understanding of memory's dual process.
He could learn skills, but he couldn't remember that he had learned the skills, or who he'd learned the skills with, or when he learned the skills. He couldn't remember specific facts anymore. He couldn't remember kind of the recent narrative of his existence.
Can you tell me what you look like?
Well, let's say I have brown hair,
Mm-hmm.
dark brown hair.
Any gray hair?
I don't know. See, I don't remember that at all.
And so it's kind of an awful, awful fate to have because you lose your continuity as a person. But it was a scientific benefit in the sense that people began to realize that was the purpose served by the hippocampus.
Even after gaining this newfound understanding of the hippocampus, neuroscientists continued to study HM. In 1961, Suzanne Corkin, a graduate student studying under Brenda Milner, was introduced to the research subject who would later define her career. After opening her own lab at MIT and assuming Brenda Milner's role of lead researcher, Corkin intensified her involvement and eventually became the sole determiner of who could or could not access her prized patient.
For a decade of these experimentations, Henry provided his own consent, establishing the second tragedy of HM's story: unethical treatment of a human subject.
If he was going to read a multi-page consent form, by the time he got to the end, he is inevitably going to have forgotten the beginning.
By the end of his life, Henry was nothing more than a brain to his research team. Consequently, Henry's death on December 2, 2008, launched a well-choreographed plan to remove his brain and ship it to the University of California at San Diego. There, Jacopo Anase, a UCSD researcher, dissected HM's brain into 2,401 slices. From those slices, Anase and his team created an online database of the famous brain, preserving these detailed images for future generations of scientists and students. Corkin called this a beautiful finale to his enduring contributions to neuroscience.
While Corkin and MIT made significant scientific discoveries, the relative gains from studying patient HM paled in comparison to the tragic dehumanization of Henry Mollison.
After some time, you can't help but think, okay, enough is enough. These researchers, as much as they denied this, they did look at him as non-human.
After the intensive studies Corkin and MIT performed on patient HM, Corkin made the troubling decision to shred some of their original research files.
What's going to happen to the files themselves, do you know, Phil?
Shredded.
Shredded? Why would they be shredded?
Nobody's going to look at them.
From unclear consent to the destruction of these files, both the personal story of Henry Mollison and the scientific narrative of patient HM are marked by tragedy. Henry's lobotomy and the ensuing experiments occurred at a time in the United States when there were no concrete laws concerning human research.
His case is an important one for us to remember in the long term and to learn from. It did happen in a very different time frame, but that's how we've actually gained knowledge and improve protections of human subjects, is by basing our framework on cases that happened in the past.
It wasn't until 1974 that the National Research Act was passed, establishing the basic principles of bioethics in America. It was unethical cases like patient HM that provided the necessity for this law and the establishment of institutional review boards across the country.
It's very difficult question to answer, and I think it's still being answered with bioethics. But how much can we do without violating this bound of human decency?
To avoid the dehumanization that plagued monumental experiments in the past, modern-day society must prioritize ethical treatment towards individuals like Henry Mollison to avoid the exploitation of subjects like patient HM. Only then will we have truly triumphed.